We will now proceed to the presentation by Dr. Duinker. I note that Dr. Duinker was contracted by the Joint Review Panel under the authority granted to us by the Joint Review Panel Agreement that allows us to retain independent experts to provide information or interpret technical and scientific issues. Welcome, Dr. Duinker.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and greetings to the panel. And I thank you for this opportunity to try to help the panel interpret the environmental assessment before us. My name is Peter Duinker, and to reiterate, I am here at the behest of the panel to speak to quality of work by the proponent and its consultants on methods for cumulative effects assessment and determination of significance. I am a professor in the School for Resource and Environmental Studies at Dalhousie University, but I speak on behalf of myself only. And I come to this subject matter as a scholar and practitioner of environmental assessment for almost 33 years, 25 of those as a professor. I would like to start with a short preamble that gives some context for the kinds of points of view that I have, and then I will make a summary of the substance of the report I filed with the panel. I'll start with the purpose of environmental assessment, which I see as to support sustainable development by providing development decision makers with useful and defensible information on expected impacts of development alternatives on the environment. I believe that utility should be determined by the decision makers. Whatever information they declare they need for confident decision making is what they should get from the information providers. But defensibility is determined by methodological experts who are well versed in the standards that, when applied, can deliver high quality information. And indeed, many such experts may well have helped develop those standards. Now, in this context, these are not standards of a profession because environmental assessment is not one in the classic sense of profession. We are practitioners, but not professionals in the classic sense. In my view, those standards relate to both inductive and deductive approaches to building evidence for conclusions about expected impacts. The inductive work relies on empirical data, things we can know from observation and the conclusions we can make based on those observations. And the deductive work relies on strong logical reasoning, things we can know by working through cause-effect linkages based on rules of logic. My intervention here today addresses some of what I see as logic errors committed by the proponent and consultants in assessing cumulative effects and in determining impact significance. I will reiterate this point at the end, but let me make it now as well, that I find it important to point out that despite the errors of logic, I cannot therefore conclude that the findings are wrong. However, I can say that they are suspect and unreliable. It may turn out that the same findings would be reached if one were to correct the logic errors. But it may also turn out that different findings could be reached, and this can only be reliably determined by correcting the logic and applying it to generate new findings. And I've not done that, and it would take a much larger effort than I was charged to undertake. So on each of the two themes, I'll structure my brief presentation relying fully on my written submission according to 4 considerations. First, what the proponent was guided to do. Secondly, what the proponent did. Third, what I see as the methodological errors. And then fourth, how the work ought to have been done. Starting with significance. What the proponent was guided to do, mostly in the guidelines, but there is also an earlier agency document giving guidance on the judgment of significance. The proponent was asked to assess significance of all residual adverse effects in terms of magnitude, spatial extent, the temporal dimensions, irreversibility, context, and likelihood, and to have done that with a transparent process. As I could understand the environmental assessment, the predictions were made for residual adverse effects on valued ecosystem components, and likelihood was determined in advance, by definition by the proponent. And these were, residual adverse effects were advanced for significance determination. 5 of the 6 criteria, not likelihood because it was applied in advance, were used, and for each were developed limits, both qualitative and quantitative, for the assignment of low, medium, and high categories. Then 4 of those were used to derive categories for environmental consequence, and that was combined with low, medium, and high categories for socioeconomic importance to finally arrive at significance. In my view, the professional judgments used for the criterion classifications are arbitrary and largely unjustified, both the limits and the combinations. What we have in this environmental assessment, in my view, is transparency in how the limits and combinations worked, but not on why they were set the way they were. I also have registered some discontent with the concept of may not be significant, which also means may be significant, and that's documented in my report. I believe the decision trees are highly arbitrary and misleading. There is no justification in the main document of the environmental assessment as to why certain combinations of high, medium, and low for the several categories lead one to where one ends up in the judgments of significance. I think a sound approach would be to make the impact prediction on its own terms, not in terms of categories, and then to interpret the prediction in terms of the 6 criteria for significance with strong quantitative and qualitative reasoning to arrive at a judgment of significance. On the matter of cumulative effects assessment, the proponent was instructed to identify and justify valued ecosystem components chosen for the cumulative effects assessment, to speak to the unique time and space dimensions of each one, to examine cumulative effects over the life of the project, and to assess pathways and trends in that assessment. The proponent focused on other projects with overlap of effects in type, time, and space. They need to have effects in the same time, in the same place, and to be of the same type. I believe, in addition, the proponent has suggested that the project itself must have a residual adverse effect before it is sensible to consider any cumulative effects. I believe that that's a highly constrained view for all 4 of those factors, but especially 2 that I'd like to speak more about. The topic of residual adverse effect, the claim that a project needs to have a residual adverse effect before one should consider cumulative effects, has been in the literature for a long time, and I'm on record as saying that it is a wrong consideration. There are lots of examples in daily life and in environmental assessment where no effects can be determined from single projects, but if they operate together, we get an effect. Just think about trying to use an epoxy glue kit and imagining whether you get a stick effect from the first thing you put on and don't put anything else on, or you put the hardener on only and you also don't get a significant sticky effect, but if you put the 2 on, you get the effect that you want. There's no effect from the 2, either one singly, but together there's a significant effect. The other one has to do with type of effect. The environmental assessment argues that the same projects must have the same type of effect before we can consider cumulative effects. And in my submission, I made I drew out an example of a fish population that might be affected by an industrial operation on one hand, that might also be affected by residential developments on the other hand, and thirdly, by fishing. Certainly all three of those, with very different effects on the fish population, could be seen to have cumulative environmental effects. So I believe the view was unduly constrained. In my view, a sound approach would be to abandon all those constraints, choosing the VECs wisely, which I do not discredit the proponent for, look at all the potential stress agents, natural as well as human, in projects as well as other actions. There is no guidance that says it's only accessible projects that need to be considered. All other human actions that may have an effect. Combine those stress agents in sensible ways and predict how the valued ecosystem components might respond. And then to contextualize those effects predictions in the significance criteria and reason out a logical conclusion. To conclude, I would like to address the issue of acceptability of methods used in environmental assessments. Just because everybody does it a certain way doesn't make it good. It means that the way something is being done is doing the trick to allow people to get on with the business they're in. I might bring up an unsavory example of fighting in hockey. Because it still happens so often does not make it right. I'm on record in the refereed literature saying that most cumulative effects assessment in project-level Canadian environmental assessments are trivial. And I stand by that observation. I haven't written about significance since 1986, but this process is a significant motivator to do so. On both significance determination and cumulative effects assessment, I think the EA is sufficiently flawed that the findings cannot be trusted. The environmental assessment's findings, though, may be reasonable, but one cannot declare that with any confidence because of the logical flaws. I thank the panel for the opportunity to present my findings orally and to serve the panel in this important environmental assessment process.